Hi, we're group 14. My name is Samantha Orr and this is Jasmine Gomez. Today we're going to be talking about Toni Morrison's Recitatif. One of the important lenses to view this story through is that of racial discrimination, particularly with the two main characters, Twyla and Roberta. Though they experience many of the same things, especially as children, Twyla and Roberta are heavily implied to be are stated to be different races, and are heavily implied to be white and African American respectively. Some of the background traits that they share include that of racial discrimination. Both of their mothers are described as being racially intolerant, with Twyla's mother stating they never wash their hair and they smell funny, and Roberta's mother refusing to interact with Twyla's mother, presumably on the basis of her race. They also have issues with abandonment. Twyla and Roberta live their childhood lives in a state home for girls, one for either orphan children or children who have been abandoned. Twyla regularly comments, "We were dumped." One instance of this is on page 2637. In addition, Twyla and Roberta both struggle with failure in academic and other standardized success settings. Twyla comments, "We were 8 years old and got Fs all the time," on page 2637. Likewise, they live in a culture of fear, particularly with older girls who also live in this home. They commented at length about being afraid of these girls and how they would run away from them, but how neither Twyla nor Roberta wanted the other to know that they were afraid. Finally, and most importantly, both Twyla and Roberta have instances of scapegoating. Both of them use a different character, one who will be discussed at length later, named Maggie, in order to find validation in themselves. Later on in the story, Twyla comments, "I didn't join in with the gargoyles and kick that lady, but I sure did want to." And on the next page, page 2649, Roberta comments that she really wanted them to hurt her. As you can see, a lot of these things are very similar between the characters. This is striking because in many stories that deal with racial contention, characters of different races will have a number of differences intended to illustrate the different experiences of people of different races. However, the circumstances of these two girls are remarkably similar. Instead, the primary differences stem from the things they want and get out of life, and their coping mechanisms. For instance, the crib blanket that Twyla uses for her infant son is a hand-me-down, something that she gets from another person for free. By contrast, every time we see Roberta, she's described as being very well off, wearing expensive clothes and jewelry. This could be a reflection of the different kinds of neglect they suffer as children. Twyla's mother was emotionally unavailable, described as going dancing and abandoning her daughter. This could make it so that the sentimental value behind the crib blanket that her mother-in-law gives her far outweighs any kind of value that a material good that could have been bought would have given her. By contrast, we don't know much about Roberta's family's financial standing, but we do know that her mother was very religious, and this could potentially lend itself to a need for material goods in Roberta's adult life. More about the author. Toni Morrison often writes about racial contention. She was born in 1931 in Lorain, Ohio, and was originally named Chloe Ardelia Wofford. However, after converting to Catholicism, she named herself Anthony and shortened her name to Toni for familiarity. Her family took part in the Great Migration of African Americans from the South, and she attended Harvard University. As an adult, she would come to teach there. In 1970, she published her first novel, The Bluest Eyes. And that novel, in addition to many of her other literary works, received a great deal of critical praise. Her fifth novel, published in 1987, received a Pulitzer Prize, and in 1993 she received a Nobel Prize for Literature. She writes a variety of novels on African American folk culture, and often puts a twist on them, focusing a great deal on racial discrimination.
The first encounter happened in St. Bonaventure. Twyla and Roberta first met in the orphanage. They both understood each other and why they were in the orphanage. Roberta's mother was sick, and Twyla's mother always went out dancing at night. They They knew that the other children hated them because their mothers didn't pass away. They just left them there. The two girls were afraid of the older girls and also witnessed them laugh at Maggie after she fell. Maggie is explained as an ill woman. They met each other's mother, but it wasn't a great encounter between the mothers after Roberta's mother refused to shake Twyla's mother's hand. Twyla's mother also acted very inappropriate in mass. Twyla always called her mother by her first name, Mary. Roberta then left in May, and Twyla's image of her slowly began to fade away. The second encounter happened in Howard Johnson. Twyla worked behind the counter at Howard Johnson and saw Roberta come out of the Greyhound bus and sat there, and she approached her. Roberta wasn't too fond of seeing her there, but went ahead and spoke to her briefly. After a conversation, Roberta was rude to Twyla, and she saw it as a way to leave the conversation. The third encounter was in the food emporium. Twyla was in the food emporium shopping for unnecessary food items just to visit the new food mart. Roberta called her while she was in the checkout line. Roberta invited Twyla to lunch and caught up on things since the orphanage. As they ate lunch, Roberta told Twyla that Maggie was pushed by the older girls at the orphanage and the coordinator of the orphanage was fired. Roberta went back to the orphanage after Twyla left and ran away later on. Then they spoke about the situation at Howard Johnson's, and Roberta explained that the black and white situation was difficult back then, but Twyla had no understanding of what was happening. Twyla became upset and knew she couldn't stay in contact with Roberta. The fourth encounter happened in Hudson Street. Twyla was driving by a school on Hudson Street. That school was becoming integrated. She saw Roberta holding up a sign that said, "Mothers have rights too." Roberta was protesting against her child being moved out of the neighborhood, but Twyla didn't see a big deal out of it. Twyla was upset that Roberta made a big deal out of it and her people picketing around the schools. When Twyla's car was being rocked by the other mothers, she held out for Roberta's hand, but there was nothing there. "You're the same little state kid who kicked the poor old black lady when she was down on the ground," on page 2647. Roberta told Twyla that she was the one that pushed Maggie to the ground and kicked her and said she was an innocent black woman. Twyla knew she didn't do that and called Roberta a liar and then drove off. The fifth encounter was in Newburgh Hotel. Twyla is looking for a Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, and here's someone called for her. It was Roberta. There she was in a silvery evening gown and dark fur coat. A man and another woman were with her. Page 2648. Roberta then sat with Twyla next to her. She was a little drunk. "Listen to me. I really did think she was black. I didn't make that up. I really thought so, but now I can't be sure. I just remember her as old, so old. And because she couldn't talk, well, you know, I thought she was crazy. She'd been brought up in an institution like my mother was, and like I thought I would be too. And you were right. We didn't kick her. It was the Gar girls. Only them. But well, I really wanted them to hurt her." 2647. She lied about Twyla kicking Maggie because she felt guilty for wanting to hurt her herself. As they cleared the misunderstanding, they then questioned to whatever happened to Maggie.
Maggie is an extremely important figure in this story because she acts as a metaphor for a lot of other potential things. So we have to ask ourselves, who or what is Maggie? Within the narrative of the story, Maggie is a mute older woman of questionable racial background. Her muteness is important in describing exactly what she is to this story and what she represents. Because she's mute, Maggie can be taken to be a representative of racial minorities, especially in American culture. Because Maggie is mute, whenever she is wronged or hurt, she's not able to speak up against those who hurt her. In fact, she's not even capable of asking for help from those who wouldn't hurt her. This is reflective of the state of racial minorities in the U.S., and especially the case in historical periods where racial discrimination was much more extreme. People of racial minority or racial minority backgrounds wouldn't be able to speak up against those who were hurting them because those who were hurting them were the ones in power in society, meaning that in addition to being unable to confront them, they were unable to find help anywhere else either. Despite this, Maggie is still very likely intellectually present. Twyla comments on page 2638 that she was afraid that there was someone inside Maggie who would hear and understand all of the insults that she and Roberta threw at her. meaning that there's a very strong likelihood, in addition to the fact that Maggie actually worked, that she was still in command of her intellectual faculties. This means that, much like racial minorities in the past, despite the fact that they are human and have an understanding of what's going on around them, they are viewed as somehow less than that, and that somehow justifies the torment and maltreatment at the hands of others. Maggie's story is also important, arguably as important as she is as a character. This story is retold multiple times. The first time we hear it directly from Twyla in Recollection, where she describes that Maggie fell in the orchard, and that Twyla and Roberta laughed at her, and that the Gargoyles as well laughed at her. Later, when she encounters Roberta at a diner, Roberta actually says that the Gargoyles pushed her down and then laughed at her. This story changes again, or one of the important elements of this change in the story is also that Roberta claims that Maggie is a black woman. Twyla claims that she wasn't, that she doesn't remember Maggie being black at all, though she doesn't specify what alternative race Maggie might have been. The story changes again when they encounter each other at a picket rally, where Roberta says not that the Gargoyles pushed her down, but that Twyla and Maggie themselves pushed Maggie down and kicked her while she was down. At this point, the story on Roberta's half is still that Maggie was black, but Twyla insists that this did not happen. In the final time they tell the story, Roberta admits that it wasn't them, that it was the Gargoyles. But at this point, the damage to their relationship has been done, and the changing of the story has already had its effect on both of them, as well as on the readers. It's important to note that Maggie is not in control of her own story. In reality, she's more of a passive agent, incapable of sharing it or stopping it or doing anything with it. Instead, it's only others who are capable of managing it. Once again, this could be considered reflective of the status of racial minorities in the US, where stripped of social power, they're not capable of forming their own narratives. Instead, it's only those with power that are able to do so. And whether it's favorable or unfavorable tends to be at the mercy of whoever is telling the story rather than the person who experienced it firsthand. Likewise, there's an uncertain conclusion. The story ends with the question, what the hell happened to Maggie? And no one actually knows. The two characters are unable to come to any conclusions either about what happened while they were present or what happened after the fact. The existence of Maggie is something that is outside of them, and something that they might never potentially understand. In this way, it's extremely interesting that despite the fact that Twyla and Roberta are stated as being different races, they are not representative of different races, but rather as individuals. This is an important part of Toni Morrison's writing because it underlines and insists on the fact that differences between people don't come from race, they come from experience, they come from the individual. Twyla and Roberta aren't different people because they're different races, they're different people because they're different people. Instead, Maggie, someone without an official stated race, is the one who represents racial minorities. And this makes the treatment of racial minorities, both in fiction and in metaphor, much more striking. And I believe that is the end of our presentation. Are there any more comments, anything we need to cover?
No, that'll be it.
Alrighty, that's it. I hope everybody has a great day.